Khmelnytsky's rebellion, Ukraine's century of ruin. Ukraine, a land forever in the crossfire. Empires clash, faiths collide, and freedom-loving warriors rise from the steppe. But who were the Cossacks? These wild horsemen who called themselves free men. Why did the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth push them too far? And how did one furious noble, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, turn personal injustice into a rebellion that shook Europe? What made Ukraine split in two? Why did Mazepa gamble everything on Sweden? And how did centuries of strife forge an identity that survives to this day? Stay with me, because once you enter this whirlwind of humor, intrigue, and blood-soaked history, you'll want to see how it all ends. Ukraine has always been the unlucky middle child of empires, too tempting to ignore, too exposed to defend. From the Kievan Rus in the 9th century, through the Mongol storm in the 13th, to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 17th, the land was constantly sandwiched between larger powers. But beneath this endless tug-of-war, there was always an independent spirit. And no one embodied that spirit more fiercely than the Cossacks of the Zaporizhian host. Horse-riding, freedom-loving warriors who lived in the wild fields and proudly called themselves free men. The Cossacks were not your average peasants. They were a cocktail of runaway serfs, steppe nomads, Tatars, and adventurers who decided farming was boring and freedom was better. Their name itself comes from a Turkic word meaning adventurer. They lived in fortified camps called sikh, elected leaders called hetmans, and balanced democracy with strict military discipline. Farming beneath free men. Instead, they raided, traded, and occasionally pirated their way to survival. When things got tough, they struck deals with the Polish crown, becoming registered Cossacks, frontier troops paid to guard borders. But this uneasy arrangement was always fragile. The Poles wanted control. The Cossacks wanted freedom. You can already smell the gunpowder. By the 1630s-40s, the Commonwealth was tightening its grip. In 1638, the king tried to make the hetman an appointed puppet instead of an elected leader. Fail, but the insult lingered. Wealthy Cossacks wanted noble status for their estates. The king promised it in 1646 if they fought the Ottomans. Parliament, the Sejm said, nope. Another insult. Meanwhile, Polish nobles flooded into Ukrainian lands, turning Ruthenian peasants into serfs. The Cossacks simmered with resentment. And then came the spark. Loving the story? Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the next chapter. Khmelnytsky was a registered Cossack with land near Chyhyryn. He was respected, educated, and had served loyally. But in 1647, his life imploded. Local Polish nobles redrew his estate boundaries. His land was raided. His young son was beaten. Khmelnytsky himself was arrested and sentenced to death, saved only by sympathetic officers. He appealed all the way to the king. Justice? Denied. That was it. Khmelnytsky took his fury to the Zaporizhian Sich, rallied the Cossacks with fiery speeches, and was elected hetman. Khmelnytsky knew the Cossacks alone couldn't topple the Commonwealth, so he turned to an unlikely ally, the Crimean Tatars. Yes, the same Tatars who had raided Cossack lands for centuries. But politics makes strange bedfellows. The Khan sent 4,000 horsemen, and together they marched northwest. The rebellion exploded. Polish troops sent to crush them were defeated. Registered Cossacks defected en masse. Ruthenian peasants rose up, attacking landlords, looting estates, burning Catholic churches, slaughtering priests, and tragically conducting pogroms against Jewish communities. This wasn't just a military revolt. It was a social explosion, a boiling over of centuries of resentment against Polish nobles, Catholic clergy, and perceived outsiders. Imagine the Polish nobles watching this unfold. We've got this under control. Thousands of peasants with pitchforks, Tatars on horseback, and Cossacks screaming freedom. Suddenly, the Commonwealth realized it wasn't facing a minor skirmish. It was facing a full-scale uprising, led by a man with a personal vendetta and a knack for rallying the masses. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a primarily Catholic kingdom, ruled by Catholic monarchs, but for centuries it had prided itself on a rare jewel in the medieval world: religious tolerance. Orthodox Ruthenians, Cossacks, and Jews lived side by side, worshipping freely. The Jews in particular had flourished, settling in towns, trading, and even becoming landlords in Ukrainian lands. But this success came at a price. When rebellion struck, both Catholics and Jews were seen as the face of Polish authority. When Bohdan Khmelnytsky's rebellion erupted in 1648, it wasn't just a war against Polish nobles, it became a social explosion of rage. Ruthenian peasants, long oppressed, rose up with pitchforks and fury, Catholics slaughtered, Jewish communities devastated. Thousands killed, many enslaved by Crimean Tatars. Priests and officials cut down, churches burned. An eyewitness wrote, "Wherever they found the Szlachta, royal officials or Jews, they killed them all, sparing neither women nor children." It was a rare individual in those days who had not soaked his hands in blood. This was not a noble revolution. It was a brutal, ethnocentric rebellion fueled by misplaced rage. Here's the twist. Khmelnytsky himself wasn't interested in freeing peasants. He even ordered his forces to suppress serf uprisings at first. But soon he realized peasant fury could be weaponized against Polish authority. So while he didn't orchestrate every massacre, he certainly didn't stop them. The rebellion spiraled beyond his control, and the bloodshed became part of its legacy. Despite the horrors, Khmelnytsky's military victories gave him leverage. King Władysław had died, and the new monarch, John II, offered concessions, privileges for Cossacks and Orthodox Christians if Khmelnytsky would stop the rebellion. Khmelnytsky agreed, but his definition of victory was not what the king expected. On Christmas Day, 1648, Khmelnytsky marched triumphantly into Kiev. Crowds hailed him as the Moses, savior, redeemer, and liberator of the Rus, people from Polish captivity. The illustrious ruler of Rus. This wasn't just about privileges anymore. The Cossacks had declared themselves rulers of an independent Rus state. By February 1649, Khmelnytsky was calling himself the sole Rus autocrat. Foreigners recognized him as a prince, even a monarch. The Ottoman Sultan himself addressed him as ruler. Ukraine, under the Zaporizhian Hetmanate, was now an independent state in all but name. The Poles, battered, signed the Treaty of Zborov, more registered Cossacks. Privileges for the Orthodox Church, ban on Polish soldiers, and oddly Jews, entering Cossack-controlled lands. But problems brewed immediately. Polish nobles returned, only to find peasants declaring themselves Cossacks and refusing to work. Nobles hired private guards to enforce labor. Khmelnytsky broke the treaty too, raising more Cossacks than agreed. War resumed. This time, the Cossacks faltered. Major defeats followed. Their Crimean Tatar allies abandoned them and even turned back to raiding Cossack lands. Khmelnytsky was suddenly on the back foot. Crops failed, allies vanished. The rebellion was bleeding out. Desperate, Khmelnytsky turned east to the Russian Tsardom. Tsar Alexei hesitated, but saw opportunity. The Pereyaslav Treaty was signed. Cossacks pledged eternal loyalty to the Tsar. Russia promised supplies and respect for Cossack autonomy. Nobles kept their estates, peasants remained free of serfdom. But here's the catch. Russia interpreted the treaty as Ukraine joining their empire. Khmelnytsky saw it as an alliance of equals. Seeds of future conflict were planted. The Russo-Polish War began. Russia seized the left bank of the Dnieper and much of Lithuania. But when Sweden invaded Poland in 1655, Russia switched sides, allying with Poland against Sweden. Khmelnytsky, furious, signed his own deal with Sweden, hoping to gain Ukrainian lands. But Poland survived. In 1657, Bohdan Khmelnytsky died. He had won independence, but never reunited all Rus lands. His death marked the beginning of the ruin, a period of chaos, shifting alliances, and decline. There was no hetman from Bohdan to Ivan, a phrase that sums up an age of betrayal, division, and endless civil strife. Buckle up, because this is the story of how Ukraine went from Khmelnytsky's fiery uprising to Mazepa's ill-fated gamble, with enough twists and turns to make Game of Thrones look like a bedtime story. After Bohdan Khmelnytsky's death in 1657, Ukraine entered what historians grimly call the ruin. Why? Because everything fell apart. Alliances, autonomy, unity, even the idea of who was in charge. Khmelnytsky's successor, Ivan Vyhovsky, looked at the growing Russian influence after the Treaty of Pereyaslav and said, "Nope, we're not becoming Moscow's puppet." So he did a dramatic 180 and tried to realign Ukraine with Poland. Vyhovsky signed the Treaty of Hadiak, 1658, which promised to turn the Commonwealth into a Polish-Lithuanian Ruthenian Union. Ukraine would finally stand as an equal partner, with Orthodox seats in government and privileges restored. Sounds great, right? Wrong. Many Cossacks distrusted Catholic Poland, preferring Orthodox Russia. Russia invaded. Pro-Russian Ukrainians rebelled. This was the first time Russian forces and a pro-Russian faction of Ukrainians fought to block Ukraine from joining a mutually beneficial union. But it would not be the last. Vyhovsky fled to Poland. Bohdan's son, Yuri, took over. And oh boy, if Bohdan was Moses, Yuri was Pharaoh's least competent scribe. He signed a worse deal with Moscow, giving away more autonomy, more Muscovite garrisons in Ukraine, Tsar meddling in hetman elections. The Ukrainian church subordinated to Moscow's patriarch. Unpopular? You bet. When Poland gained the upper hand in 1660, Yuri switched sides again. But Poland offered only a subordinate role, not equality. Result? More chaos. By the early 1660s, Ukraine was effectively partitioned along the Dnieper River, left bank under Russian authority, right bank under Polish sway. The Treaty of Andrusovo, 1667, made this official. Ukraine was carved up like a medieval pizza, with Moscow and Warsaw each grabbing a slice. For the next 20 years, Ukraine was racked by civil wars between rival hetmans, endless Russo-Polish conflicts, autonomy chipped away piece by piece. The phrase "there was no hetman from Bohdan to Ivan" captured the despair. Leaders came and went, but none could restore unity. Finally, in 1687, Ivan Mazepa rose to power. He reunited both banks of the Dnieper under Russia, ending the ruin. But Mazepa wasn't content to be Moscow's loyal servant. In the early 1700s, he tried to seize independence by allying with Sweden's Charles VII against Russia. Bold move. Except, it failed miserably. The Battle of Poltava, 1709, crushed Mazepa's hopes and Ukraine's autonomy shrank further. By the 18th century, the hetmanate was abolished and Ukraine was absorbed as a province of the Russian Empire. Independence would not return until the 20th century. Vyhovsky, let's join Poland. Cossacks, we prefer Russia. Russia, we'll invade anyway. I'll sign with Moscow. Wait, no, Poland, wait, no, I'm confused. Ukraine, partitioned like a medieval buffet. It was chaos, betrayal, and flip-flopping on a scale that makes modern politics look tame. Through centuries of domination, by Poland, Russia, Tatars, and more, Ukraine never lost its sense of identity. Even under Catholic Poland, Ukrainians didn't simply merge with their Orthodox neighbors. Even when autonomy was stripped, the Cossack spirit of independence endured. Even when partitioned, they clung to the idea of Ukraine as a cohesive unit. So when modern propagandists claim Ukraine is just a confused part of Russia, history laughs in their face. Ukraine is old, resilient, and here to stay. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more epic history adventures.